Good evening. All right, my name is Joe Bast. I'm the president of the Heartland Institute. I know many of you, but not all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for coming to our new home out here in Arlington Heights. Some of you don't know a lot about the Heartland Institute, so I'm going to start out with the mandatory 2-minute description of who we are and what makes us kind of unique among free market think tanks. Then I'm going to be introducing James Taylor and Jim Lakely, who were part of our delegation to Paris and COP-21, and they are going to regale you with stories of drunken revelry and protesters and all sorts of fascinating things in Paris. So what makes the Heartland Institute unique? We were started 31 years ago, 1984. We were started in downtown Chicago. The idea was to create a free market think tank that was similar to the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute or AEI or Reason Foundation, but instead of addressing national public policy, we would address state and local public policy issues. So we would do for Chicago and Illinois what Cato was doing in Washington, D.C., taking free market ideas and applying them to public policy issues. So we did that, and I thought got some good positive responses. After a couple of years, we opened an office in Milwaukee. Milwaukee was more interested in reform than, and Wisconsin than Illinois. And we got a terrific response up in Wisconsin. So in short order, we opened more offices in Detroit and Cleveland and Kansas City and St. Louis. And for a while, it looked like we were going to become the McDonald's of the free market think tank world. We were going to just take over the whole country, open up 50 of these offices, and really have some impact. That dream didn't work for a couple of reasons. The big foundations that were funding think tanks and nonprofit groups had no idea what we were doing. This idea of franchising a think tank was alien to them. And because I didn't have an advanced degree, I was not a prominent academic, and they said, "What business do you have starting a think tank? You know, shut up and sit down." So they weren't willing to fund us. And at the same time, state-based think tanks were getting created all around the country. So each state was getting its own truly indigenous think tank with local supporters and business leaders. We couldn't compete with that, and after a while decided we shouldn't try to compete with that. We should encourage them to grow and become their own state-based think tanks. So we closed our offices, reconsolidated in Chicago, and became a national organization, identifying as its audience all 7,300 state elected officials in the United States. 7,300 state legislators. We're the only free market think tank that sends a publication every week to every legislator in the United States. We also mail them to all the nationally elected officials. So your state representative, your state senator, your member of Congress, your senator, U.S. senator, and the President of the United States gets a publication from us every week, and lots of phone calls, lots of follow-up, lots of communication. So among the think tanks in the country, we contact more state legislators more often than anybody else. That's kind of our bread and butter. Second unique thing is we publish 4 monthly public policy newspapers. Some of you have seen some of them. School reform news, environment and climate news, healthcare news, and budget and tax news. Each of these is a monthly publication, which means once a week one of them comes out. And once again, every state legislator and every member of Congress gets one of these publications. So it's a great outreach publication that presents as news free market ideas on public policy issues. And the third and final thing that distinguishes us from all the other think tanks is we market the work of other think tanks. So there's none of this not invented here attitude or that's your turf or that's your issue, we're not allowed to talk on it. We take the best available research from all the free market think tanks in the country and feature it in our publications. We feature their speakers on the programs of our events, and we do our best to market the best available research. So it's worked really well for us. Today we have an annual budget of about $6 million. We have a full-time staff of about 35 people. I think we're doing fantastic work on a wide range of issues. We have changed public policy in every state around the country. I think we're making some genuine progress. The issue that's probably most controversial is global warming. We've been actually writing about it since the 1990s. In 1993, I co-authored a book titled Eco-Sanity, A Common Sense Guide to Environmentalism, which looked at a whole range of environmental topics. One of them was global warming. We didn't get really heavily involved until about 2006 and 2007. And then we found some donors who were willing to fund us to really go after this issue in a big way, to the tune of $2 million a year, pretty much, ever since then. And that enabled us to recruit scientists from all around the world, to hold major global warming conferences. We have held 11 of them so far, to publish massive books on global warming, as well as short books, videos. We ran over $1 million in ads in the Wall Street Journal challenging Al Gore to debate his critics. Some of you might have seen those ads back in the day. And had a real big impact. And as a result, we are now the most demonized, attacked, hated organization, I think, among the left, and certainly among the environmental activist left. If you Google the Heartland Institute, you will see endless lies, attacks, and distortions on us. It's an astonishing thing, and it's kind of a hurtful thing, because this is my life's work. I was there 31 years ago. I thought I was doing really important, good stuff. I love my organization, but when I read about it on some of these websites, I don't even recognize it. So it's a scary thing, and it's kind of a sad thing. It's about the polarization of America. So when you go online and you see some of these things about us, I hope you'll go to our website, click on the button that says Reply to Our Critics, and in there we respond to all these attacks, and we explain who funds us, why we do this stuff, why we're independent, why we're not a front group for anybody else, and why we never lie. So Reply to Our Critics is the button on our website. So we sent a delegation to Paris last week and to attend what's called COP-21, the Conference of the Parties. It's a United Nations conference. This is their 21st meeting. They're trying to come up with a treaty that all the countries can agree on to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions and to pay developing countries billions and billions and billions of your dollars to make up for any costs or inconveniences that global warming might cause them. These two gentlemen were there. They're going to tell you exactly what they did while they were there, the kind of reception that they got, and what was at stake. And I think they're going to speculate a little bit about the future of the global warming debate based on what happened in Paris. Jim Lakely is our Director of Communications. He's been with Heartland forever. How long?
5 years.
No, it's got to be more than 5.
2008.
Is it only that long?
It just seems, believe me, it seems that long for me too.
There we go. All right. Before that, he was a working journalist. He's still got ink stains on his fingertips. So this is a real-world journalist who joined the Heartland Institute and now handles all of our work with journalists, as well as event planning and a lot of other communications activities. Next to him is James Taylor, James M. Taylor, not to be confused with the other James Taylor who sings songs, I guess. James was the managing editor of Environment and Climate News for 14 years. He and his family lived in Florida. We persuaded him to move to Illinois just a year ago in December to become our vice president for external relations. James is now kind of in-house, and so he's helping with fundraising, public speaking, outreach to legislators, and making friends with all the other organizations. The two of them were in Paris. Jim just got back into the office, well, maybe both of you, yesterday or the day before. Today we had a lunch meeting. It was the first time I heard them explain what happened in Paris. So I'm learning a lot of this stuff for the first time, just as you are. So please welcome Jim Lakely.
Thank you, Joe. He described me as a former journalist. I like to consider myself a recovering journalist. It's been 7 years since my last story, and I'm going to try to stick that, not doing another one for a long time. Back in April, just to give you a little background on why we ended up going to Paris in the first place, it's not something that the Heartland Institute has done in the past. This is COP-21, which makes you think there were 20 before this, and there's going to be a 22nd one in Marrakesh, Morocco, next year, probably in either October or November. But the Heartland Institute hasn't gone to these United Nations climate confabs in the past. Other groups have. One of our partners in this endeavor was CFAC, the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. They've kind of made it a game or a something that they really enjoy doing, is kind of crashing the party up there. We see ourselves, well, we're a think tank. We deal with intellectuals, we deal with scientists in the global warming community, and so we consider ourselves kind of the intellectual movement behind some of the things that CFAC might do. But we decided we needed to come to Paris because, I think partly because of the experience we had earlier this spring in April at the Vatican. Some of you here are familiar with the Heartland Institute's trip to the Vatican, and that's kind of the background on this. That was another thing we weren't going to go to. You know, we're concentrating on other things, and in fact, and of course, environment isn't the only thing the Heartland Institute does. We do, as Joe explained, a lot of other important public policy work. But the Pope was bringing in climate alarmist scientists from the United Nations to basically tell him the state of the climate science, which is that man is causing a catastrophe, and that he needs, as the Pope, the leader of 1.2 billion Catholics, he needs to put his moral authority and that of the Church behind the idea and the entire agenda of the United Nations based on the theory that humans are causing a climate crisis. Well, of course, what we have learned through 11 international conferences on climate change is that the data doesn't show that humans are causing a climate crisis. So we thought, with about a week to go before the climate summit, that we should maybe show up and tell the Pope this. And so we got some scientists, and we got 7 scientists and climate experts to come with us to Rome. We rented space in a hotel literally about 50 yards outside of the walls of Vatican City, and we held a program and had a press conference and exposed what was really nice about this, speaking of journalists, is that the journalists here in the United States, especially the climate journalists, are not interested in hearing about the science. They're interested in demonizing the Heartland Institute, asking us who funds us, and all this other nonsense. What was nice about presenting to the media at the Vatican is that they didn't have experience in that. They were unspoiled. They were not biased against us. They actually they were interested. It was fun. And so they reported on us straight. And it was an unusual experience for me dealing with the press, I must say. And I'll probably never have that experience again. Certainly didn't have it in Paris. But we made major international news. We had features on Eternal World, EWTN, the basically the biggest Catholic channel here in the United States. We had stories on The Wires, Reuters, Bloomberg, AP, UPI, it was all around the world. The Heartland Institute was there. We were mentioned in all the stories about this big climate conference with the Pope. And that really, really irritated the environmental left in this country and the media in this country. It's like, you're not supposed to report straight on the Heartland Institute. You're not supposed to just report what they say and give it equal weight. And so coming back on the high of that, we started thinking about Paris. Now, of course, we knew we weren't going to get the same kind of media reception in Paris with the world's climate media there, but we decided we needed to go anyway. The world's global warming alarmists were staking so much on Paris in COP-21. This was going to be the moment, the time, the last chance, they said, to save the planet. And they were going to save the planet, I guess, by coming together and agreeing that we can control the climate. Success for them was the mere act of getting 196 countries to agree to the words in a single document without anybody dissenting that said, had no binding, nothing binding is in this Paris Agreement. No one is forced to spend money on mitigating climate catastrophes that are not going to happen in developing nations. But they all agreed on the wording in a piece of paper, and to that, and if you understand the UN, and I do now after going to one conference, and it's a strange experience to be around so many people in the UN at once, but just the moment of agreeing to them is an accomplishment. And it's a fantasy. The document is full of really, it's delusional. They actually believe that now that 196 nations are together and have formed this giant hand that will put its fingers upon the thermostat of the world and knock it down about 1 degree Celsius. And that will save the world. They actually believe this, and worse than that, the media believes it. These were the leads in the New York Times and the wire services that we saw, that the world has come together to agree to save the planet, to stop warming from happening over the next century, or to keep warming from happening over the next century to below 2 degrees Celsius. Who believes that is possible by signing a piece of paper? The United Nations delegation does. Our president does. Our media does. And I guess some members of the public do. At least they pretend to do so. So the purpose of that, there was not a single presentation on science by the UN COP-21 delegations. Not one. James and I were there. We spent a day, it's about as much as we could take, walking around, going to different press conferences. We tried to get a question to Al Gore. Got very close. Didn't quite get the question in, unfortunately. Or the video had already been running on a loop on Heartland's webpage if we had done that. But there was no talk about science. There was no talk about the fact that there's been no global warming for the last 19 years as measured by satellite data, which is the most accurate way to get quote-unquote global temperature. There was no acknowledgement that the polar ice caps are not in a crisis state, that the Arctic ice cap is within relatively normal levels of the 30 or 40 years that we've been able to observe it by satellites, and Antarctica is setting new records on ice accumulation. I don't even know if anybody in Paris knew that, but that's a fact, and it certainly wasn't talked about when they were there. And there was also no discussion, just a third data point, there was no discussion about perhaps the sun having some influence on the climate that might be more than humans' contributions to a trace gas in the atmosphere that has a diminishing impact on global warming as you go on. The sun? Yeah, they didn't talk about the sun either. And so we were there to talk about those things. So, so we brought with us, we had a program that we put together for one day. First of all, we had a press conference for an hour to start off at 9 o'clock a.m. in Paris. Now, Keely knows a lot about Paris, and if people have been to Europe, 9 a.m. is a little early for most Europeans, even professional press, to start something. But we had, so we started 9 a.m. in Paris, which is, what was it, 2 in the morning here or 4 in the morning here? 2 in the morning here, 7-hour difference. So we had our program, the entire program was starting when all our core audience was asleep. The people in this room, I hope you were asleep. Most people on the East Coast, they were asleep. But we started our program with a press conference and then a presentation on science, a keynote address, and then another program on energy policy. But we still, despite the fact it was in the middle of the night, we had 1,800 people at least tune in for part of our day-long program. We had almost 13,000 views of a video that is on our website that is 6 hours and 45 minutes long. Now, when most people go to YouTube and they see a video that is 6 hours and 45 minutes long, they're too scared to click it. I have never looked at a video that long, but we've had quite a few views of that video. And, but the press conference was actually quite raucous. We had protesters trying to get in, burst down the doors. Keely Drukala, the Deputy Director of Communications for Heartland, who will join us for Q&A when that portion of the program begins, was very fast on her feet. She got to the door and kept it closed. It kept a lot of people dressed up in clown suits from coming in and making a scene. And so that was good, but that's what they wanted to do. What was interesting, though, is that the media actually made up for that by standing up and making clowns of themselves by asking completely irrelevant questions. We had presented to them, I told them at the beginning, we have some of the most prominent scientists in the world who understand the science of climate better than anybody you've ever met, and certainly anybody better up at Le Bourget, which is the suburb of Paris where this conference was going on. Not a single question came from the media about the science, not even to ask, why do you believe humans are not causing a climate crisis? No. It was all about who funds you, you should be ashamed of yourself. It was ridiculous. So it was, again, the press that we expect, the climate press, certainly on an international scale. But our first program, in that press conference, I just want to acknowledge Myron E. Bell from CEI, one of our partners in this endeavor, stood up and spoke, and he was very patient with the questioners, which I was very impressed with. David Rothbard and Mark Morano from CFACT were also there, as well as James Taylor and myself taking questions. If you go to heartland.org, the second slide on our homepage is an image for our work on COP-21, and you can see we separated out the press conference video for an hour so you can kind of get a flavor for what it's like to present climate science to a hostile audience. Our first program was moderated by James Taylor, and it featured Fred Singer from the United States, Bob Carter from Australia, Willie Soon, who was born in Malaysia but has lived in the United States now for 30 years, and Christopher Essex from Canada. So I was like, we're kind of bringing our own little United Nations delegation together of scientists from around the world, and they gave fantastic presentations on the science, the latest science on the climate. And then we had a keynote address in the middle. Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma had hoped to come to our conference, and he has gone to these COP-21s in the past kind of for a one day. He'll come in, irritate the press, and then go home, and he finds it interesting and fun thing to do. He was going to include us in his program, but they were working on the budget back in Washington, D.C., so he could not get away. But he did take the time to record about an 8-minute address to us and to our audience, and we were able to broadcast that on our live stream to the world, and that's been viewed several thousand times as well individually. And so we were really honored, and I thank Senator Inhofe for taking the time to do that. And then there was another presentation by James and also by one of our other presenters. Then we had a panel on energy policy, which was moderated by Tom Harris of Canada from the International Climate Science Coalition. Patrick Moore, again from Canada, he's one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, who has left that organization long ago because he discovered they were not pro-environment, they were anti-human. And there is a huge difference, and he's been evangelizing against their radicalism ever since with very solid logic. Nick Loris from the Heritage Foundation was also with us. He's an energy expert for Heritage in Washington, D.C. Wolfgang Mueller, who is one of the bigwigs in an organization called EIKE, which stands for the European Energy Institute. Yes. I keep seeing it in German in my head, and I can't get it out in English. But we actually joined EIKE. That's where ICC 11 happened, was in Essen, Germany, a 2-day conference where we joined our friends at EIKE, scientists, almost all of them speaking German, giving presentations on the science. It was really interesting to see the European perspective on climate science and to see the European science community come together to talk about these issues in the way we've seen it in the United States for so long. That was very interesting. And then Christopher Monkton was the last presenter at our event, and if anyone, I can see some people smiling already. Anybody who has heard Christopher Monkton speak will usually smile at some point and probably all the way through. We also we took part in other events there. There was something called the Paris Climate Challenge. Some of our speakers participated in that. It was similar to our program and earlier than ours was. We also met some great classic French libertarians from an organization known as ALIP. So those are new friends of ours at Heartland, and we're looking forward to working with them in the future. And then our big day, we called it the Day of Examining Data on December 7th, and we wrapped it up with our friends at CFAC. They have a new film called Climate Hustle. And they rented, Climate Hustle. Figure it out. Pretty good film. They rented out a historic theater in Paris. And of course, just like everywhere we went, protesters showed up. There was a sign especially made for us that said, "Welcome, Heartland Institute scum." I took a picture. It's in my pocket. It's great. And then all sorts of things that we're guilty of climate crimes, and you'll be sorry, the world will never forget. And I thought, I really hope the world doesn't forget. Because when this climate hysteria ends, I want the Heartland Institute to be known as the one who was getting it right and who was not hysteric. And that would be the best outcome. Although an outcome I will accept is people just forgetting the hysteria ever happened, and we can just move on with our lives and start making sense of the world again. So that's the kind of the wrap up from my perspective, is trying to organize the event with Keely and the people we had with us. I'm going to leave it to James Taylor to talk a little bit more about what happened up on our adventures at the COP-21 conference, as well as some of our perspectives on what the future of the climate change movement is post-Paris. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim, for the lead-in, which gives you an overview of what we did. Before I fill in some more details, first of all, I just want to thank each and every one of you that are here today. Sometimes it can be hard because the media wants us to believe that we stand alone, that nobody pays attention to what we're saying, nobody's influenced by what we're saying, and that when we present scientific truths like we did in Paris, that it's falling on deaf ears. And if we're only paying attention to the media, we're going to believe that. But then at an event like this, and we had a similar event at lunch today, when we see people that are giving up their evenings, that are coming out here, that are interested in the facts, it encourages us. It keeps our fire going. So by your mere presence, you're having a tremendous impact. Also, many of you have donated to the cause, donated to our trip. And without those donations, starting at $10 and on up, but even every $10 donation had a large impact. We knew, and I'll discuss it in just a moment, why this particular conference was one that we felt a need to attend. But it's not like we have an endless supply of money, so we had to figure out whether we could even afford to do this. It's near the end of the year, and at the beginning of the year when we set our budgets and we have a little money in the bank, we map out the year. But by the end of the year, unlike many other think tanks, they take pride in having tens of millions of dollars sitting, wasting away in some bank account where they can say, look how successful we are. We have $30 million here. When people give to the Heartland Institute, we put that money to use right away. We don't sit on it. We make sure every penny counts. You know, if you're giving to the Heartland Institute, you don't want to see a difference 30 years from now when we tap into that $30 million. You want to see it now. So we get to the end of the year and we run pretty tight sometimes. We're running pretty tight this year. And so when we thought about whether it was worth it, we decided to put on the internet our fundraising campaign. We sent out a fundraising letter, and it's the efforts of everyone in this room, people who are watching via the live stream, that made it possible. Because without that, we wouldn't have been able to go. So thank you so much. The reason why we decided to go to this particular meeting, this is, as Jim mentioned, this is COP-21. There have been 20 before this. The Heartland Institute has never attended a conference of the parties by the United Nations. And many groups, many NGOs, particularly environmental activist groups, but across the board, they do like to go. They choose cool places to go. They'll choose Rio. They'll choose Paris. They'll choose, you know, wherever they think people might want to go. It's a nice junket. It'd be nice for Joe and Jim and I to go to wherever this place, you know, wherever the meetings happen to be, and have a good time. But that wouldn't be putting your money to good use, and we refused to do that. This time was different because Barack Obama is in his final year of office. And we're nonpartisan. I'm not going to react to that. But anyway, he's in his final year of office. This is what he views as his signature accomplishment, binding the United States to legally enforceable, whether it's domestically or internationally, restrictions on carbon dioxide. When Obama had large Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, cap-and-trade legislation, despite all his full efforts, despite the efforts of Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, could not pass a democratically controlled Congress. Here we're in the final year of his term, and he knows that even for all the EPA restrictions his administration is imposing, those can be undone by a future president. There's no cap-and-trade law. The only hope he has to make sure that in years in the future that we are bound by these carbon dioxide restrictions is to have us internationally bound, so that our Congress, our domestic policymakers, cannot repudiate or roll them back. So this is his one big chance. For months, he's been talking up how this is going to be the moment where the world comes together and the United States commits to these internationally legally enforceable agreements. That's why we decided to go, because this is unlike any other COP meeting in the past. We wanted to make sure that if he was going to try this, which clearly he was, one, the American people will get the word from Paris, not just here, but in Paris where we are with the Obama administration, they might be more likely to hear the message. The two other nations understand that there is a scientific message. There are scientific truths that they haven't heard, that they're not being exposed to. And that three, that any time that the collectivists of the world, the left of the world, are going to try to restrict Americans, and not just Americans, but people throughout the world with their big government, with their free market economy killing regimes, the Heartland Institute will be there to stand up for freedom and free markets. So we decided to make that trip, and I'm happy to report that we were more successful than I'd even hoped. Starting first of all, before we got there, when word got out that we were going for the first time, it drove the collectivists crazy. Before we even went, and Jim referenced this briefly, there was a group up in Canada, and they sent a letter to the Canadian government seeking to impose criminal charges, criminal prosecution by the Canadian Attorney General against the Heartland Institute. Two other Canadian groups, and the Heartland Institute. The reason being that we were spreading these lies about climate. By bringing scientists to Paris and having them discuss the scientific evidence that you can look up in the peer-reviewed literature and the government official data from the satellites, etc., we're spreading lies. And they want us criminally prosecuted. But it wasn't just your run-of-the-mill leftist environmental activist group, some wackos out there. The people that signed that letter to have us prosecuted, it's absolutely frightening. First of all, you had a large number of university professors in Canada that want to stifle freedom of inquiry, university professors. Second, the former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations signed that letter, that if we are to challenge what the United Nations proposes, we should be criminally prosecuted. But worst of all, as far as I'm concerned, a lead author of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a current sitting lead author, signed that letter, sending the message that if anybody, if any private citizen, if any public advocacy group dares to challenge, dares to question what the United Nations tells us should be the case, you will be prosecuted. But we don't care. We decided to go anyway. Also, at the same time, there was a letter sent to the United Nations telling them that they should kick us out. They shouldn't let us into Paris, into their meetings. They should kick us out and ban us from all future meetings. Again, because we don't agree with what the left is saying. And finally, one that might have been the most nefarious of all, but I have to admit there was a little humor here. About a week before we left, we received a copy of a letter sent to Interpol. And they accused the Heartland Institute of being a drug smuggling operation, of being environmental terrorists, and coming right on the heels of the Paris terror attacks. That, to me, I mean, that's nefarious. That's despicable. They need all their resources hunting down the real terrorists, and they're trying to divert their attention to coming after the Heartland Institute. But the part that was rather humorous, I have to admit, was when saying that we are drug smugglers, we have a drug smuggling conspiracy, they mentioned somebody who's on my immediate right as having a history of smuggling drugs into other countries, doing so by putting illegal drugs in little balloons, swallowing them, and then excreting them when he gets to the host country to sell. And therefore recommending that Jim Lakely be given a full-body cavity search upon entering France. I thought that was pretty funny. If they had done so, I think it would have been worth it, but they didn't do that.
I didn't even get frisked. It was a little disappointing.
But the point is, these folks will stop at nothing. They'll stop at nothing to keep us out, and the reason why is because we're effective. Because when you're here showing up, when you're donating to the Heartland Institute, when we're putting our resources to addressing this topic, we're effective. So we got to Paris, and the first day that we were there for the meetings, I really want to extend thanks to Myron E. Bell at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He got Jim and I access to the actual meetings. He had, I forget what the technical term is, it's not a press pass, but an NGO pass of sorts. So we went in, and the first thing we did is we saw that Al Gore was scheduled to speak. And we decided that would be a good one to attend because Al Gore was going to talk for 15 minutes and then he was going to take questions for 45 minutes. Now, folks, Al Gore does not do this. He never takes audience questions. On the very rare occasion he does, it's only under two circumstances. One, if he's giving a talk to major donors, so it's for him to get money, or two, if he knows he's in a room where everybody agrees with him and there will be nothing critical asked. Well, I guess he imagined because it's a United Nations climate conference and all the NGOs were filing in, the environmental, non-governmental organizations, that he would be amid safe company. So Jim and I, we got there about an hour early, and we got right up to the front row so that during Q&A, we're right there. It'd be hard to miss. And I had it planned out, my question and everything. So here's what happened. We were among the first ones in, and the people who got there earliest were the ones near the front. Those who thought it was worth their time, they're going to give up an hour of their time at the United Nations conference. Others that just dribbled in later, okay, so be it. This is how poorly the conference was run. 5 minutes before Gore is allowed to, or is scheduled to come on stage, an announcement is made that everyone has to leave the room, the door's in the back. Everyone has to leave the room and then come back in after a security check. This is after we had a security check just to get into the facilities. Like Al Gore is someone special that people are going to try to find some way to get to after the first security check. The problem is everyone who was there the longest, then because the door's in the back, they were the last ones in line. And I'm thinking, my goodness, we just gave up an hour so that I could be up front and ask a question, and now for nothing. So what I did is I took this tablet of mine, which I had brought with me, and I left that on my chair, so hoping that no one would take my seat. So in the meantime, we go out back and we fight the crowds. We're at the end of the line. And just as they're about to let everyone in, they make another announcement. Well, we changed our mind. The 150, 200 of you that are here, you have to go to another room down the hallway. So now not only am I at the end of the line, I then have to go and get my tablet. So it turned out I was in the back of the other room. And so was everyone else that got there early. There were a lot of angry people. And the worst part is when Al Gore finally talked and took questions, he was taking questions almost entirely from the front 4 rows. In other words, the people that had gotten there last at the other meeting that didn't invest anything, any time, effort, energy, were the ones being asked questions. Anyway, at the end of the session, finally, the person on stage who's moderating looks in the back rows, and he looks right at me and points. And I'm pumped up because I'm ready. So the young lady who had the microphone, now she's off to the side, so she's triangulating where he's pointing. And instead of going to me, she goes to the person right behind me. So disappointed. So here's a question that I had in mind, a question we almost got out, and I'm sure would have been Al Gore's worst nightmare because he's never taken a question like this. And I was sure at the time we are now going to be on the newsreel, on the loop forever for Al Gore hypocrisy. Now, I was going to make sure I asked this without personal animosity. I don't want to be hostile in tone. I do want to be professional. But at the same time, these are the questions he should hear. So my question was this. Vice President Gore, people, I think justifiably, really admire people who practice what they preach, who lead from the front, who'll do what they ask others to do. So my question to you is, coming here across the Atlantic, specifically, which mode of public transportation did you take to cross the Atlantic to reduce your carbon dioxide emissions? And specifically here in Paris, which specific mass transit mode of transportation did you take? Now, I suspected at the time, and I later was able to confirm, that he flew his own private jet to Paris and certainly did not take the subway like Jim and I did. It would have been a fantastic soundbite because the whole time he's railing against how all these evil people and increasing carbon dioxide emissions, and yet he can't even fly commercial first class. It would have been beautiful. Maybe next time. But it wasn't a failure across the board because there were two other sessions that we attended. The first one was put on by the Natural Resources Defense Council. Now this one was real interesting because they had their vice president, I believe it was, and their top person in India. And the third person was the Indian environmental minister. And he announced during his talk that India was going to commit to producing 40% of their energy from carbon dioxide-free sources. And when he made that announcement, NRDC, they were so congratulatory, and not just congratulatory, now they started pointing a finger at the United States and Western democracies. India, which is struggling to escape poverty, India, which is struggling to get all their citizens electricity, even India is committing to 40% clean power, wind power, solar power. If India can do it, the Western democracies, and especially the United States, not only can, but should and must. Well, as he was saying this, I was thinking, you know, I know India also dabbles in nuclear power. And they didn't give a specific percentage of this 40% that would be wind and solar. NRDC trumpeted it as wind and solar, but I didn't hear that from the Indian minister. So when question and answer period came, I raised my hand. Now, when I raised my hand, I think that the NRDC vice president recognized Jim and I by face. I mean, they certainly spend enough time worrying about us and trying to vilify. So when I raised my hand, made eye contact, and he's immediately looking somewhere else for someone to call on. The thing is, you might have heard about how there were 40,000 people that attended this summit, this climate conference. Garbage. There might have been 2,000. Jim says 5. He's being generous. I think 2. Regardless, there weren't that many. Even if it was only 2,000, you would think NRDC. On their website, they talk about how they're the most effective environmentalist group in the world. So you think their press conference, they might have a good turnout. There were maybe a dozen people in the room. I'm not kidding. So when I raised my hand and he's looking around for a lifeline, there's no lifeline. There's only 12 people, and I'm the one in the front row with my hand up. Half of the 12 people were international press, so they can't just ignore me. So he calls on me. And my question, again, respectfully, was this. You mentioned that that India will be meeting a 40% carbon dioxide-free electricity mix. Can you tell us specifically what percentage of that will come from nuclear and hydropower? And secondly, can you tell us how much economic burden the people of India should and will bear to pay for that? So as soon as I mentioned nuclear power, the Indian minister, his face just lit up. He beamed. And he was so happy to say, I am happy to say that India is renewing its investment in nuclear power. We are going to put more money into nuclear power, not just for India, but for every developing nation in the world, especially in the tropics. Our goal is to see to it that nuclear power is expanded and that all nations have more nuclear power. Boom! NRDC hates nuclear power. Their website is an anti-nuclear power diatribe that never ends. So here at their own press conference, their star witness who says carbon dioxide-free electricity, NRDC does this misinformation. See, wind power, solar power, the U.S. needs to do this too. Bad U.S., bad U.S. No, they're saying nuclear power. I thought that was great. That was a tremendous impact that we had, I thought. The next one that we went to was a panel discussion by the Climate Action Network. And if there were 12 people, well, there were 12 people or so in the NRDC meeting, there were only half that number in the Climate Action Network meeting. I thought that was rather amusing as well. Their discussion quickly focused on what they referred to as human rights. I say what they referred to because as a classical liberal, I have a particular notion of what human rights are. But our folks on the collectivist left, Well, they often have an entirely different definition of what human rights are. So the folks on the panel, they were so happy to report that they had access to the government negotiators that were hammering out the agreement. And because of their efforts, there was going to be specific human rights language in the document. And probably not just in the preambles, but in the hardcore text of the language itself. And now their next goal, and they were optimistic, was to make this legally enforceable. Well, they didn't really get specific about what human rights they were referring to and how they were defining them. So when Q&A period came, I raised my hand, and as one of 3 people that weren't present in the room that were attending, of course they had to call on me. So my question, again, respectfully, was, can you tell us specifically what human rights you're putting in the document, specifically how you're defining them, specifically how you're going to enforce them? Well, the answer was fairly vague again, but the one human right that she was willing to mention, she talked about labor rights. And she gave a specific example of people in the coal industry who are going to lose their jobs because of the climate agreement. It was nice that she acknowledged that. And she said, we want to make sure that their human rights are respected and that they have particular rights for job displacement. And as far as how that would be defined, well, we're going to leave that to the International Labor Union because they are the experts on this topic. Are you kidding me? So we are going to have legally enforceable language in the United Nations climate document saying that anybody who loses their job as a result of the agreement or who loses their job as a result of climate change now has the international labor unions dictating to the U.S. government what their rights are and how they will be enforced. This is something, sometimes I think we have a tremendous impact on public opinion, on the press. I know that the folks at the United Nations were upset that we were there, and I think they were paying attention because Jim and I, we did a podcast discussion. We recorded one of those and put it on our website right away. I wrote an article to post on the Heartland website. And what happened when 4 days later when they announced their agreement? The labor issue was nowhere to be seen. No mention of labor. So I think we had a good impact on that. From there, we had our day of examining the science. Jim discussed that. I don't think there's much more need to go into that, other than to note that to just show the influence that we had and how rewarding it was. At that event, we had press from MSNBC, from Reuters, from The Australian, which is the premier media publication in Australia. The Washington Times covered us extensively. We only had, between the whole skeptic community in Paris, maybe 20, 30, 40 of us. The Heartland Institute, we brought over about a dozen. And the UN's talking about how they had 40,000 people signed up for their conference. We're outnumbered by thousands to 1. And yet, when we showed up, the media couldn't put a blanket on it. We live streamed the event. We're covered by all these major events. The activists showed up in force. In fact, let me tell you what they did. They were so ticked off that we were there. They put, according to the media, I didn't see it because I was in the conference, although I found some of the residue later. They put literally thousands of wanted posters all over the streets of Paris. And they had photographs of people, 7 or so, of who they consider the worst climate villains. Now, at a time right after the Paris terrorist attacks, if you put up a wanted sign with someone's face, that's a pretty drastic measure. In the fine print, they would say, wanted for crimes against the planet. But these are folks that are on edge. There were military personnel in tactical formation walking all over the city. People are quite nervous. And they put that up, and they're diverting attention away from finding terrorists real threats to people, to civilization, to France. Well, if they're going to do it, I think it was despicable. But if they're going to do it, I was very happy to see this one. Among the 7. Their intent is to intimidate, to harass, and to chase away anybody who might speak up by saying, if you speak up, you're going to find your face in a wanted poster in a country that is on edge and fearing terrorism and where you're going to be treated like a terrorist. I think that's despicable. But if they're going to do it, I am so glad it was my face, because I am always willing to stand up for liberty, to stand up for freedom of expression, to stand up for sound science, and the Heartland Institute joins me in that. From there, we held our 11th International Conference on Climate Change with the European Institute for Climate and Energy. Jim mentioned that. And I think it's entirely appropriate and deserving to mention Wolfgang Mueller and EIKE, their acronym. as much as we're fighting an uphill battle, and you all feel it, we fight an uphill battle with the media, not with American public opinion. We're winning that battle. But the media don't want us to know that. And they're going to vilify us. And they're going to try to brainwash our children. We fight an uphill battle. But in Europe, it's even worse. And so EIKE, they're fighting a battle in which they're just trying to let people know that there is a scientific debate on the topic. People have no idea what the science says because they don't have access to the media that we have. They don't have access to the message. And they put together such a fantastic program. I mean, they filled the room. You would have to have 10 NRDC conferences to put as many people in the room as Ike did fighting the uphill battle. And as Jim mentioned, we had scientists speaking primarily in German, European scientists. These are folks with a tremendous knowledge of the science. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. Wolfgang Mueller reports they had more and more. They've had more scientists in the past speaking. They intend to have more in the future. These are folks that we were very proud to team with. I hope we can team with them in the future. They did a fantastic job. As a result of that conference, we had college students in the audience. We had their professors bringing them in to hear something they hadn't heard before. They're making an impact. And when I talked to Wolfgang, I said, you know, Wolfgang, here in the United States, our impression is that in Europe the battle's lost. Is that the case? He said, well, it's a lot harder here, that's for sure. But I'm happy to report, I spoke there 3 years ago at this conference. Wolfgang said, James, since you've been here, I can see the difference. We're not a majority yet, but people are finally beginning to understand it's not an open and shut case like the media tells us. We're making a difference. So ICCC 11 in Germany, we helped Wolfgang make a difference, and that was a tremendous success. And again, thank you for allowing that to happen by your support. Finally, I'll conclude on this note. What was the result that the United Nations claims from the Paris talks? And are those results that they report accurate? If you've been paying attention to the news, they're hailing this as a tremendous victory. Finally, we have all the nations of the world coming together in agreement, agreeing to keep warming down to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And everybody has signed on. The United States for the first time signed on because we didn't sign on to Kyoto in 1997. Okay, maybe so. But what they signed was a hollow, toothless agreement. If the agreement were to be implemented in the United States, it would be devastating. What it does do, if it were implemented, would commit the Western democracies to $100 billion each and every year to hand over to developing nations for climate reparations, for climate damage. And if you look at the Western democracies, you'd have to guess the United States share would probably be about a third of that. You divide that $35 billion among 115 million American households, that's $300 each and every year that's being sent as a new bill to every household in this country. On top of that, the carbon dioxide restrictions would wreck our economy. Wind power, solar power, these increase the cost of electricity 2, 3, 4, 5 times what we're paying now. This would negatively impact our household income by thousands of dollars every year if we were to switch over to the wind and solar economy that they envision. If indeed this agreement were binding, the Obama administration signed it, if it were binding, yes, it would be devastating. Cause for their celebration, the Obama administration's, cause for the rest of the country's regret. This would be the worst economic devastation our country would have seen since the Great Depression, and maybe going back further. But, and here's the important but, the Obama administration does not have the authority to obligate the United States to international treaties without Senate approval. They tried to word the agreement. They took out the shalls and musts so that it was no longer a treaty. It was a statement of intent. It was a statement of purpose. And fine, the Obama administration can intend and purpose all it wants, but it needs the budget outlays to do it from Congress. It needs congressional authority to make it binding. And that's not happening. It's not going to happen in the future. There's a little bit of playing around in the omnibus that was just passed today. That omnibus allows the Obama administration to shift some already allocated spending to this program, to the Green Climate Fund. The amount that I'm looking at, first inclinations, first impressions, is about $500 million. That's not chump change, but it's not $35 billion either. So the point is, the Obama administration got what they wanted. They could save face, say they had this great accomplishment as they leave office. But in reality, we won. We won. We spread the word. We let them know we would not be railroaded, we would not be pushed over. And in the end, what they agreed to, what they saved face with, was something that is not going to bind us, not going to bind our children, not going to wreck our economy, unless, and only unless, Congress goes along with this. Congress isn't going to do it. They better not do it. We're here to make sure they don't do it. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to questions, but finally just reiterate. I've said it once, I've said it twice, I can't say it enough. Without you, we couldn't do it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support for being here. Thank you for financial support, which without that support, we couldn't go in the first place. You make it possible, and we are forever grateful for that. So thank you.
Oh, that's right. All right. James, Jim, thank you very much. James' description of changing the room at the last minute and forcing everybody to get up and then move reminded me of United Airlines, Washington, D.C. and Chicago. I have had nightmares with United Airlines changing gates at the last minute, making everybody run down to the new one and stand in line to re-register and then go to a different one and do the same thing again. We almost came to fisticuffs once at the airport with everybody was so angry and so frustrated with that. So, questions. We've been joined by Keely Drukala. Yep, Julie. Keely was there doing the video and what else? Logistics, security,
Everything.
apparently.
Security. I
Yeah.
mean, she speaks French. She has a lot of experience in Paris, so we could have nearly pulled this off as well as we did without Keely. So,
That's
round of
right.
applause for Keely Drukala.
There you go. Yep. So thank you, Keely.
Everything technical that needed to be done, all the arrangements for hotels, for transportation, beating up of the protesters when I was hiding under a table, that was all Keely.
You're scary. All right, now we have time for Q&A. Any questions? Tom?
Is there any sense among journalists that they've practically gone beyond satire on this? I saw one headline in the triumphalism after the agreement, and it basically said eventually emissions will go down to 0 worldwide. I thought, gee, no animal will be allowed to exhale anywhere in the world. Is there any sense that they've completely gone off the deep end on this?
It's too easy for me to go first.
Normally, that would be like shooting fish in the barrel because the media is so far to the left in the collectivist camp, environmental activist camp, that yes, everything originates with the media, or at least is very quickly multiplied by the media. But in this case, I would say not necessarily, because the media in this case really is accurately reporting what the governments of the world and the environmental activist groups are saying, that we've done, so we're going to reduce emissions to almost nothing. So the media is actually accurately reporting what the Obama administration, the United Nations, and the environmental activist groups are reporting. But they're reporting it because they failed. The Obama administration made it dead clear months before the conference, the bottom line, the basement level of success, would require committing the United States to internationally legally enforceable carbon dioxide cuts, and they do not do that. So they're taking a victory lap because they don't want to have egg on their face, but they have egg on their face. And the media is just accurately reporting what they're trying to claim is true, but we know is not.
I did see in one news article it mentioned that it would involve the United States rolling back their emissions to like mid-19th century levels or even down to 0, and then there was like a comma, which might not be likely to happen. At least they're acknowledging that this is a little bit fantastical, and that's why going to COP-21, being around these people, listening to them, and they really believe that because they signed a piece of paper that is completely bizarre and delusional, that they're saving the planet, and a lot of the media reflected that. I think the media wants to be part of the parade. They want to be able to say, we also helped you. One of the really interesting things, and this was a video, and if we find it again, I'm going to put it on Heartland site so you see it, but on my phone, looking at Twitter feed, a friend of mine on Twitter had sent me a video, and there was a journalist in the press room at COP-21, and they were all sitting there waiting for the announcement that the agreement had been made, and as soon as they made the announcement, it was raucous cheers and a standing ovation in the press room. And it went on and on. It was like they just won the Super Bowl or something. And so that gives you a great idea of what the press's attitude toward this is, and the fact that the Heartland Institute gets mentioned at all in these things because we're bringing the science, I think, speaks even louder.
Yeah, this creates and I will ask Larry, right? All right, Larry, you're up next. But we've had some interesting conversations about tactically what do we do going forward We're convinced that this was a major victory for global warming realists, okay? They lost. The left lost in Paris. They put everything on the line. They thought they were going to get an international treaty. They know that whoever is in the White House next year is not going to keep Obama's plans alive. So this was their last chance to set in cement all of these policies that the Obama administration has pushed through just as regulations and executive orders. They lost that. They lost at a number of other levels. They didn't get the financial commitment from developed countries to fund this green climate fund. Yeah, they didn't get that. And they were really counting on getting a mandatory commitment from developed countries to do that. And they'll never get it. With entitlement crises on the horizon for all the developed countries of the world, as their demographics change, they're all in debt. They're all facing entitlement crises. They're not going to fund that sort of redistribution of wealth into developing countries. So I think it was a huge victory for us. We knew going into this that no matter what happened at this conference, it was going to be declared a tremendous victory for the global warming alarmist side, that this was Obama's legacy. It couldn't fail. No matter what happened, it couldn't fail. The headlines would be the same. They wrote these headlines 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. So what we need to do, I think, is say, the mainstream media isn't going to tell you this, but that conference was a huge flop, okay? Virtually nobody attended. Fewer people attended it than attend what is it?
A minor league hockey game in Muskegon, Michigan, yeah.
There we go.
I looked up the attendance, and there were more people at a minor league hockey game than would be at those things.
There we go. I don't follow sports, so he's my sports guy. So, I mean, nobody showed up. They didn't agree on anything significant. All of these goals are set way into the future after the current generation of politicians are long gone. There's nothing mandatory. There's no enforcement vehicles. This was a complete flop on their side. It's a historic moment. We're going to look back on December 12th, 2015, and say this was the day that the global warming movement died. And it died in Paris, okay? None of the mainstream media wanted to admit it. None of the politicians admitted it, but it died right there. And you guys were there. You watched it. You even might have helped make it happen. Larry?
So this sounds like
It's working.
yeah,
It's working.
that despite the belief in this new religion and that you guys are heretics, villains, and terrorists and all of that, that the governments have recognized that this is a giant hoax, scam, and they're just going to pay lip service to this from now on. Is that the case? I want to just also just ask this sort of corollary question. So-called sensible climate, global warming people like Bjorn Lomborg and Matt Ridley, who say, well, it could possibly be happening, but we shouldn't destroy the world's economy to do this. In fact, dealing with malaria is more important, for example. Were they there? Were people like this getting a hearing, or is it just these wild extremists? And as you say, the press is the main cheerleader for this.
So, great questions. Taking your last question first. We were the only group that had an organized event, our day of examining the science, in the entire city. 40,000 government representatives, activist groups, activist members, and it was just us having an event. CFACT, they launched their premiere of Climate Hustle, and then there were some others. I believe Bjorn Lomborg actually was in Paris at the time. But we were so outnumbered, thousands to one. And many of them, had we not put on our day of examining the science, we probably would have been ignored as Lomborg was. Well, maybe not. We're pretty prominent. They hated us for going before we even got there. But we did, I think, fight that uphill battle and win. As far as the nations of the world, seeing this as just a joke, I don't think it's quite that simple. I think the developing nations that stand to be on the receiving end of the Green Climate Fund, for them it's very convenient. They get to scapegoat the United States and others for their own problems at home. They get to avoid political responsibility. At the same time, they get a commitment for $100 billion every year, and right away, rather than expressing gratitude, immediately upon that pledge being made, they said this is not nearly enough, and they put in the agreement that we will immediately thereafter begin looking at progressively increasing that amount. For them, it's a wealth transfer that props themselves up. Most of these third world leaders are personally profiting from international wealth transfers. It's not going to their people. Even if it were, it's politically profitable. Next, you have the developed nations of the world, Western Europe, Japan, the United States. I think for most of them, most of those leaders, they've bought into the global warming crisis. And because they are statists, because they're collectivists, they think that if they make this pledge, that therefore they've done something substantial on the topic. I also think they don't understand that here in the United States, whether or not John Kerry signed the agreement doesn't mean anything, because it's not binding on Congress, it's not binding on our appropriations, it's not binding on our energy policy. They'd like to think they're making a difference, and even for them, most of the burden's being shouldered by the United States. And I think that we're the only ones that are calling it straight and calling it for what it is. Russia and China have refused to be bound to kick in. China says they might consider contributing a little bit, and that's like a wonderful thing that they might consider a little bit. That's why China wants to sign on to it. Why not? We are being hamstrung by expensive energy sources. They are not. We're going to have a hard time competing against them when our costs of manufacturing goods and services are much more than theirs. We have to give money to developing nations, and when it's convenient for them, they call themselves a developing nation. I mean, they might be the ones receiving it, so we'll borrow from them to give to them. So yeah, they're devoid of any obligation, so of course they're signing on.
This isn't a climate treaty. It's a climate on the redistribution of wealth globally. That's what it is. If it was a climate treaty, maybe they would have talked a little bit about the climate. They didn't. They weren't there to talk about the climate. All the conversations were about who's going to get the money, where's it going to come from, and is it going to be mandatory or not. In the conference, the press conference we were in with the delegate from India, somebody had made the faux pas of asking the question and used the term donation, as far as like the donation to the developing economies and the nations that are threatened by climate change. And he says, no. These are not donations. Stop using that word. These are mandatory. These are obligations from the polluting countries of the world to the victims, their victims, countries around the world. As it turned out, it's not mandatory, but we will see how many people come through with that. But it's all about the redistribution of wealth on a global scale. It has nothing to do with the climate at all. And to answer your question about Bjorn Lomborg, there were 7 people who had a wanted poster. Bjorn Lomborg was on one of them. So that gives you an idea of how this man, who is the most pleasant demeanor you could imagine, he actually agrees with them on probably 99% of the things that they think about the climate that's going on. And his only objection is that money should be used to help the poor in different ways. And for that, climate criminal. Get rid of them. That's the kind of opposition that we have here. It's difficult to have a conversation with people who have that kind of an attitude. If Bjorn Lomborg can't have that conversation, nobody can.
And I will quickly add that I think it was entirely fitting, sad, but entirely fitting, that type of behavior, that type of get rid of them, off with his heads, that this agreement that embodied that was made in the city of the terror and the great terror.
Good point. All right, Jim.
Thank you. Not all journalists are wackos. And there's one notable exception on this issue, and his name is Steve Chapman. He's a member of the Tribune editorial board, and I think I can count him as a friend from 40 years. We first got acquainted when he did a piece for The Nation on the law of the sea, which is very similar. And what bothers me is that Steve Chapman just last week had an article about how the science was sound, the alarmist science was sound, and not only that, but the best technique for coping with it is a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Now, I've been searching my mind on how to move Steve Chapman off of this issue. Does anyone else have any ideas?
He didn't respond real politely when I tried to correct him the last time he wrote a long piece about global warming. We used to play volleyball with Steve Chapman when the Heartland Institute was first getting started. Good guy, good libertarian writer. He's wrong on global warming. Libertarians don't agree on lots of things, and the science on global warming is complex enough that I would respect Steve's opinions on that. If he wants to have a debate, let's have a debate. Let's talk about it. So I don't judge him too badly for being wrong on the science. You know he's wrong on the economics. It's this simplistic attitude that, oh, there's a problem. The solution, the most efficient solution, is a carbon tax, right? I mean, every economist knows when you have negative externalities, you internalize the externality by taxing the bad activity. If you tax it, you get less of it. If you have a tax on emissions, then the people whose costs of reducing emissions are highest are the ones who pay the tax. The ones whose cost is the lowest can actually sell their emission permits, and it's very efficient. You end up with reducing emissions at the lowest marginal cost, and everything works beautifully. The problem is there's no need to reduce emissions, and government has no idea what the right level it should be. So you're asking the government to dictate a level of emission that it has no way of setting right. Every attempt to do this in the past in the climate change debate, in the global warming arena, internationally, has collapsed because governments create too many permits. They politicize it. Jim Johnson himself has written about how they deny private property rights status to the permits so they can arbitrarily take it away from you or double the number of permits next year. So you just spent $10 million buying permits so that your plant can release emissions, and the government doubles the number of permits next year, and the price of the permits is cut in half. So you've just lost half of your investment in your permits, and you have no right to complain because you have no property right to it. That's how governments create cap and trade programs. That's how carbon taxes work. That's why a good libertarian economist shouldn't agree it.
Than Gary Becker, who's been honored by this institution for superlative work in economics. And I'm sure that's where Steve Chapman got the idea for the revenue neutral.
If I can jump in a little bit here, there are some who are advocating a carbon tax who normally are free market people, but it's not the controlling. Not to mention my brother, whom I love and is on our side on so many topics, but on this one I think he's just dead wrong. But anyway, my brother Jerry heads the Niskanen Center, another public policy organization. But I would ask Steve, if he's watching, to really reconsider the term, if he used the term revenue neutral carbon tax. Because that term is used, I imagine for Steve not intentionally, but it's used as a bit of a head fake, and I think he fell for it. Because when you hear revenue neutral, what you're thinking is economy neutral. There are really no costs because what you're taxing, you're then handing back elsewhere. But here's the thing. If the purpose is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and that's the stated purpose, you can only reduce the emissions by inducing people not to pay the tax, but to buy other sources of energy that are much more expensive. In other words, if you tax coal and natural gas 20%, people are still going to buy coal and natural gas because it's still not nearly as expensive as wind and solar. You may collect a lot of revenue, but you're not meeting the purpose, which is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. To reduce carbon dioxide emissions, they have to tax coal and natural gas so heavily that they are now more expensive than wind and solar. Once it's more expensive than wind and solar and people are purchasing wind and solar power, government's not collecting any tax revenue. So what you have, you may call it revenue neutral, but it's certainly not economy neutral because every person in this country who's spending significantly more money on their energy, both directly in terms of utility bills and built into the cost of every good and service in this country, they are paying a substantial penalty, and it may be revenue neutral because no revenue is being collected, but it's certainly not economy neutral. And I think when you use the term revenue neutral, you're giving people the impression that it has no negative economic repercussions, but it certainly does.
You know, I think I would agree that would be a persuasive argument for everybody except Gary Becker. I mean, he is a Nobel laureate in economics, and he knows all this stuff. And if Steve Chapman gets this opinion from Gary Becker, I think we have to have better arguments.
Well, of course, Gary passed away earlier this year, right? Was it? Yeah. And he and I talked about he and I talked about this as well. And he said, "Look, I'm not a scientist, and my colleagues tell me that the science is settled on this." And as an economist, my job is to find the most efficient solution to this, and that's a carbon tax. And I said, as an economist, you should understand when science gets politicized. You should understand, what the left is doing in this debate. Your job isn't just to package groceries in the bag at the end of the counter. Your job is to actually take some responsibility for what's going in that bag, if I can use a bad analogy. And he didn't agree. He just said, hey, I'm not a scientist. I just accept the science as it is.
Okay, but it's worth noting, and that's a good point, but it is worth noting, for example, if you look at the Copenhagen Consensus, there were quite a few Nobel laureates there. They had people, you can point to somebody who's very learned, and certainly we should respect and consider very carefully someone who's an expert on the topic, what their argument is. But it doesn't mean they're the only one with that expertise who believes that. If you look at the Copenhagen Consensus, you have Nobel laureates who say, look, we should not be spending our money on this. This is wasting our resources. We can spend our money much better ways. So I would, rather than appeal to authority, if we're going to appeal to authority, make sure that is the sole authority at the top and there's no one else at that level who disagrees. In this case, that wouldn't be so. And second, even if that were the greatest authority, that still doesn't make him right. I mean, you still have to examine the evidence. But I do agree with you that we should always, at the Heartland Institute and all of our friends and allies, every day be looking at the evidence, challenging ourselves. Could we be wrong on this? And if we are, then let's follow where the science and the economics takes us. If we don't do that, we're not being honest. I try to do that every day, and I think that's where it's taking us, and I hope everyone does. But your points are well taken, and by all means, send me whatever material you have that might persuade me, and I promise you, I'll look at it with an open mind and get people who are more learned than me in economics to do the same. You're so sly, Jim.
Very good. Next question. There we go.
Keely is
Nancy.
sitting up there and very patiently waiting for a question. What was your most memorable experience when you were in Paris, as far as helping the group or stopping people from coming in, or anything else that you consider that you were really a great asset to the group, which you were, of course?
I would say my biggest memory was actually the day I flew home. So it actually wasn't helping Heartland by any means. But there was 2 terror scares at the airport. They closed down my terminal twice. They blew up a suitcase twice. They were pushing us out of the way. We took off 7 hours late. It was quite an experience that I don't think I've ever experienced, traveling to France 2 or 3 times a year. As for the question for helping Heartland, definitely it was the protesters. I even spoke to a few of them prior to them actually trying to push our way into the room as I'm holding the door closed. But prior to that, I even asked them, they flew from Australia. The protesters that came to our event flew from Australia. And they didn't come just for our event, but they came to protest overall. And I asked one of them point blank, do you realize that you're wasting more carbon flying halfway around the world to protest this event than anybody in Africa will ever spend in their life? They didn't get it at all. At all. But definitely, yeah, holding the doors closed while trying to live stream from the front of the room while speakers are going back and forth, and I'm like, I can't be in 3 places at once.
I actually have a follow-up on that. I know some people have asked this question to me. You know, the terrorist attacks happened 2 weeks before we arrived, and there was, in fact, protesters they were supposed to be 500,000 people in the streets. You know, numbers are numbers. You know, Million Man March. You know, 100,000 or 500,000 people going to be marching on climate. But there were going to be a lot of climate activists that were going to be professional protesters that were going to be there in Paris, and because of the terrorist attacks, Paris pulled the permit. You know, so a bunch of them showed up anyway on the Monday. A bunch of tear gas was in the air. People were arrested, put under house arrest, and that pretty much took care of it. But there was these activist groups that had all of this energy and anger to get out, and the putting thousands of wanted posters around the city was part of getting that energy out. But I got a lot of questions from people asking, well, how was Paris? What was the mood of the people? And Keely has been to Paris often, and she speaks fluent French. She goes to restaurants. She has friends. You know, she has a real good feel for the city. So I think to have you talk a little bit about what the city was like as far as just human feeling in the wake of what happened.
Okay. okay. I had actually been in Paris 2 weeks prior to the terrorist attack and then had come back now 2 weeks afterwards. And I went there really expecting it to be different. I thought there would be a more depressed mood, that it was going to be very, very different feeling. And actually was kind of upset thinking that, you know, my friends who have never been to Paris were not going to get the Paris experience. But truthfully, it was very, very much the same. Besides a little bit of extra security, you know, having to open your purse every time you walked into a store, a monument, even the grocery store, having to take down your jacket to open it up to show that you don't have any bomb to your chest. Besides that, it was actually very much a very similar city. The people went along with their daily lives, and they really are not sitting there thinking about what happens.
Very good. All right, next question.
Thank you. I saw two questions. I saw a update or a interview with Lord Monckton, and he said that there was a movement that came out of Paris, out of your meetings, about a global liberty movement or party or something like that. I was wondering if you could comment on that, or if you know what he was referring to. He made some kind of reference to that. And my second question is in this debate, Arthur Brooks, I saw an interview with him in which he talked about if you're debating between the issue of justice and the issue of freedom, freedom loses because justice is a more primary issue. And so how do you address that kind of a dynamic in this debate in order to kind of flip the issue? Because you know, I don't know if you have people flying from Australia to march in the streets for freedom in the same kind of way that there's a visceral thing about trying to fight for justice, even if your categories of understanding what is just in the debate are skewed and misunderstood.
Did any of you hear Chris Monckton describe the creation of a new political movement or organization?
I did not, and let me tell you, Christopher Monckton is irrepressible, and we were so happy that we were able to bring him with us. He was part of our contingent, and he spent every waking moment with media, with allies, with people on the street. He's a tremendous asset, and it doesn't surprise me at all. And even though he was the last person of the delegation I saw, we actually trained together all the way to Brussels, and then we split off. It wouldn't surprise me at all. So that's a good heads up that I'll get in touch with Christopher and talk with him. In terms of the second part of your question, in terms of a visceral type of message, sometimes it's hard when you're arguing against people that are driven by emotion and not by reality, and you can't ignore it. You can't just say, well, that's just emotion, because it's powerful for people. And I think if we're going to be talking to people who pay attention to and are concerned about facts and logic, we win. And when we're dealing with people who are ruled more by emotion, and that's not a bad thing, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we're fighting an uphill battle. One of the things I like to do is I like to point out that money doesn't grow on a tree. People know that. Everyone knows that. And when we're devoting our scarce resources to cutting carbon dioxide emissions, which is unnecessary to do, but even if it were giving us some benefit, that money comes at the expense of people's budgets for quality housing, good nutrition, quality health care, quality education, all of the goods and services that are necessary for us to live longer lasting, healthier, and more enjoyable lives. And you can't just look at your wish list in a vacuum. And still, that's still kind of more rational, logical. But when you say these are the trade-offs, do you want to give up your health care? Do you want to give up education? Then sometimes it hits part of that issue for them when they want to make the emotional appeal.
The organization that is trying to bring up Friends of Science, the International Climate Science Coalition, and the Heartland Institute on charges, criminal charges in Canada, the name of that organization is Eco-Justice. And when you put a word in front of justice, justice is not important anymore, and justice is usually out the window. But I do think it is important, because when it is a question, especially I think maybe for millennials, when you're talking about justice or freedom, they've been brought up through college and everywhere else, justice is a very powerful term. And I think we need to start using that in the climate skeptic community, in the climate realist community. For instance, is it justice to send billions of dollars down the gaping maw of UN corruption that will never help a single poor person. Is that just? Is that justice? Is it justice to have Africa remain dark because you will not allow them to build even nuclear power plants, let alone coal-fired power plants? Is it just that those children, can't go to school or they can't light their homes at night, they can't get into a modern industrial society? Is that justice? Is that justice for those people? And I think it's really important to think of ways you can turn the language of the left around on them, because most of the time, the things that they say, the words that they use, are the exact opposite of the effects of what they actually advocate. And so that's where I think it is important to use that term. And I'll talk to Christopher Monckton about it. Maybe he can put it on his agenda.
Very good. There are some really good libertarian organizations that are trying to address those issues and emotion and justice. So the Acton Institute, if you're familiar with them, okay, I mean, they're very much in tune with that. The Free to Choose Media, Bob Chittister's organization, Free to Choose Media, they did the Milton Friedman series on PBS many years ago. They're doing a whole series of movies and documentary films that try to connect with young people by talking about values. And you're absolutely right. Justice is a postmodern value, and it's social justice, and it's really risen up the ladder over the last 20, 30 years, and it is taught from kindergarten through college graduation, and we need to address it. It's got a long history in the freedom movement. Those of you who read your old books, Irving Kristol, Two Cheers for Capitalism. I don't know, has anybody read that? Do you remember it? There we go. Two Cheers for Capitalism, I don't know, 1967 or something like that. Really good little book. The last chapter says it it criticizes Friedrich Hayek for not talking about social justice. And that's why he only gives capitalism 2 cheers instead of 3 cheers, is because it's not really a just system, according to Irving Kristol. So Hayek, 5 years later, responded, in my world, the famous appendix to the Constitution of Liberty is why I am not a conservative. And that was written specifically to answer Irving Kristol, in which he says, actually, capitalism is just. In fact, it's the only just system. You cannot have justice without respecting the rights of individuals to follow their own ideas. You can't have values that are coerced. And in the absence of freedom, free trade, free enterprise, private property rights, there's no such thing as a moral code. There cannot be justice. And it's a beautiful essay, and I recommend it all to you. But it's 40 years old now, so I guess nobody reads that stuff anymore. Dan Hales?
Oh, thank you. Stuck up on me.
Well, don't let him hold the microphone. Take it back from him.
Very interesting discussion tonight. Harlan has done a magnificent job of nailing down the facts and shifting the debate from examination of the facts. Clearly, the facts are on our side. So why is this movement persisting? And Jim Lakely hit on it, in my mind, a few minutes ago about wealth transfer payments, which conjures up in my mind great events like George Scott and the Flim Flam Man, the Wizard of Oz. Remember at the end, you get the curtain open, there's a guy working the organ. This is what's happening on the other side in order to preserve their opportunity to bilk the wealthy Western nations by a hoax and transfer payment to some of the other nations is what you say is going on. And that's not enough. These people don't operate out of virtue. They operate out of greed. And there's going to be people in the movement that skim off a large amount of money and put it in their own pocket, like I think Gore has done. So should we start concentrating a little bit more on motive instead of facts? I mean, we've got the facts and we have to continue to argue them. But let's dig down deep and put the light on some of the principal players and their misdeeds. Is there any possibility of thinking further about that, or is it too premature?
You know, when Heartland was started, one of the fundamental rules, I think, that I heard by the founders and the board was we don't attack other people's motives. Okay, it's about ideas, and we debate ideas. We don't debate people. We try to remove the names of people and even politicians from our writing and try to address ideas. That sounds pretty naive today. I don't know, we're in a very polarized world where, yeah, millions and billions of dollars are flowing into advocacy organizations that oppose freedom. I mean, are we stupid by kind of saying, oh, we don't go there, we don't talk about your motives? You know, you're making millions of dollars off of this scam, but we're not going to talk about that because that's impolite. Well, frankly, it's the most powerful argument that we could make in a world where people are concerned about justice and fairness, because that's unfair. These are climate profiteers. They are making money off of the backs of the poor. They are destroying jobs because their kids are working for the government and for EPA, and yeah, we should be expressing moral outrage over that. So it's not just a debate about ideas and facts anymore. It's got an emotional level. We're grappling with that, as I think you can tell. I mean, I'm not too comfortable going in that direction. But we are doing more research on the other side. So we have a new project called leftexposed.org. Go on, just Google that website. It has profiles of groups on the left and individuals on the left, and kind of exposes their connections and their funding and maybe their motivation.
If I can add,
I'm still hesitant to go there. Go ahead, James.
somewhat related to motive are purpose and intent. And those are topics that we do address. The topic of global warming, climate science, it's an issue of science. And sometimes people ask, why are you involved? Why is this a free market issue? And it's because the purpose and intent of these imposed carbon dioxide restrictions is to restrict individual liberty, is to impose a government-centered economy with top-down mandates. And if you're going to propose that as your solution, then we better make sure the problem as described exists. And that's why we're in this discussion and debate. When we looked under the hood, I mean, yeah, look, if we're destroying the planet, I guess you got to do what you got to do. But if we're not, we better make sure that we're not going to ruin our economy and further the objectives of the radical left, who have always desired these particular solutions that they're advocating now. And just as a side note, as you were mentioning, you know, why are we fighting this, or, you know, what are we doing in the future? An analogy that I thought of, and often I thought of it today, and I thought of it during the Paris trip, is that, you know, we're a city. We're a city that's a fortress. We have these stone walls that are surrounding us, and we have science within those city walls, and we have freedom, and we have sound economic principles. But the same folks who have the purpose and intent of destroying freedom, of destroying capitalism, they're the ones that are charging those walls. And so far, we fought them back. We scored a tremendous victory in Paris. We fought them back there too. But they only have to breach the walls once, and our fortress is destroyed. And that's why we have to, even though we won this victory in Paris, we can't rest on our laurels. Because if we do, they breach the walls once and it's too late. So we have to be ever vigilant, and we intend to do so.
Very good. Jim says we have time for 2 more questions.
I have two.
Jim, what do you think of that? Or maybe 4 questions and 2 questioners.
Relative to what you just said, James, well, I'm confused in my mind now. So I'll go to what I have written down. I'm in the ag industry, agriculture, and so there's a lot of corporate backing of the mania of climate change and how it may or may not affect food production in the world. There's a lot of corporate interest, energy. I wonder why. I mean, these are free market business people who.
Check your premise.
Okay. Okay.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Well, I think you get where I'm going. Why such a large amount of corporate support for this? My second question, as to the victory, congratulations on what you guys accomplished in Paris. Call it a victory for now. What are the implications as politics change, as they do, to our nation. That's the only one I care about. Let's say we don't keep sane-minded people in Washington. What are the implications going forward of this agreement?
Regarding the first part of your question, Joe, I sense that you may want to weigh in on this. I'm happy to if you...
Go ahead.
Free market corporations.
Yeah, that's it.
You know, it's really funny. The media, the left, they like to say, big oil. You know, you're funded by big oil, or you're doing big oil's work. Two of the corporations that have been most vocal, most adamant about imposing carbon dioxide restrictions are BP and Shell Oil. And there's a reason for that. I mean, there really is no alternative to petroleum-based transportation, at least not right now. What's being proposed, ethanol, is at best carbon neutral and probably more carbon dioxide intensive. I say carbon neutral, carbon dioxide neutral. So really what the oil companies have is they have a vested interest in these restrictions, because what it means is that for electricity, unlike transportation fuel, electricity is something you can change, and there are alternatives. And one of the alternatives to coal is natural gas. And they're producing a heck of a lot of that in addition to oil. And you have these companies, they're out for their bottom line. I mean, that's what it's all about. It's not a bad thing, but that's what they're going to do. What is a bad thing is when they use government to beat up on consumers, to coerce people to purchase their product, or to restrict access to other products. And so oftentimes people think just because they're business, then they're pro-free markets, or that they're allied with Republicans or free market groups or conservative think tanks. No, we're in this for consumers, we're in it for taxpayers, we're in it for individuals, and corporations aren't. It turns out that a free market is going to benefit business more than a government-focused market. So in principle, on the larger scale, they're more likely to side with us. But there's nothing they like better than using their connections with government to restrict competition and give themselves favor. So it's an intricate web that is weaved and that we have to play in. The second part of your question was... Right. Yeah. And what we've done in 2007, Al Gore's movie came out. We had, you know, Joe mentioned how we work primarily in the state legislatures. I mean, we work across the board, but that's our focus. We had Republicans that were telling us, we're scared to work with you, because when you take this stance on global warming, you lose credibility on everything else. And we said, the science is on our side. And maybe some people are going to call us risky and say we shouldn't do it, but we're going to stand up for sound science. And now look at that. Look at the candidates on stage at the presidential debate last night. I'm not convinced that all of them in their hearts are on our side, but you bet not a single one's going to go out and say they support the Obama climate agenda. Times and circumstances have changed, and it's because of the people in this room. It's because of the Heartland Institute. It's because of our allies, CFACT and CEI. If the political landscape changes, where you can have President Obama and large Democratic majorities in the House and Senate passing a cap-and-trade bill, it's not going to be in the near future. It didn't happen in 2009, even when he had those majorities, and it's less likely now. We're making a huge difference. And the reason why he wanted this agreement in Paris is because he realizes that there's a decent chance the next president will roll back much, if not all, of what his EPA has done. So we're making a difference. Yes, politics and political whims can change, but we've set them back decades, and they hate us for it.
And the corporations, I think most corporations find it easier to embrace green philosophy, green slogans, green whatever. I mean, that's what their PR agencies are telling them. Their ad guys are telling them. All the young people who work for them are telling them that. They all believe it. So why would you take a controversial position that opinion polls suggest isn't supported by a majority of the public? Our experience with corporations is long and really interesting, and I think what we discovered is there are good people and bad people inside every business. Unfortunately, over time, the bad people, I think, have pushed out the good people, and in particular, the ad agencies and the guys who think that they have their finger on the pulse of public opinion are overruling what used to be a strong CEO or VP or chief economist inside that organization, and they say, look, we're spending $80 million endorsing Natural Resources Defense Council's efforts to defend polar bears, and so we're going to put a polar bear on every can of Coca-Cola. And there are people inside Coca-Cola, inside the government relations department, who think global warming is pure nonsense. But, you know, what are they going to say? You're not going to confuse the public by seeing Coca-Cola as a supporter of the Heartland Institute. So they're all in or they're not in at all. That's what we kind of encountered. One last question. David.
Media bias, which we all know about. The public opinion polls always kind of, as far as the last ones I've ever heard, kind of indicate that the public is still skeptical about what the environmental extremists have been advocating. No? Am I wrong?
Well, there's a lot of variation in the opinion polls. James and I kind of track that. Every time Pew updates it or Gallup updates it, we try to look at that, see what's going on. There's a lot of push polling. So the question is, do you care about your grandkids? Do you care about the climate? Yeah. I mean, and how you phrase it. Yeah, global warming versus climate change. I mean, answers to questions on the phone are significantly different depending on the phrasing that they use. I think the most important question, and then James maybe can comment on this, the most important question is how much are you willing to pay to fight global warming? Not what is your opinion, not how deeply do you care about it, but are you willing to pay $10 a month more for gasoline if that made a difference on climate change? And when you start asking questions like that, well, 20% say they're willing to spend $10 a month, and 8% say they're willing to spend $50 a month, and 4% say $100 a month. Well, the environmentalists are calling for $1,000 a month. I mean, huge increases in energy costs. So I think when it comes down to if the public could vote on what the environmentalists are proposing, they would vote it down 99-1. Unfortunately, that's not quite how democracy works. We don't get to vote on those proposals. We get to vote on politicians. James?
Yeah, and that's a fantastic question, David. If the question is worded along the lines of, do you believe government should do something about global warming, then you'll get your 70% or so that'll say yes. If they ask, how much are you willing to spend? If it's even $5 a month, an overwhelming majority says in that case, no. If you ask people, do you believe that humans are causing global warming? You'll get roughly 50-50. Maybe a slight majority say yes, but even skeptics will say humans are a cause or a contributing factor. The real question is, are you very concerned about it? Is this a crisis? If you ask people, are you very concerned about it, it's an overwhelming majority that say no. And when they ask them to rank, they give them 15 or 20 topics, and which one's most important? Global warming is always dead last. So, you know, if you ask people they like government to act, and they say, look, people want politicians to act, well, they say that in a vacuum. And I think in the real world, the polls show that we are winning. And when I say we, I don't mean we, the Heartland Institute. I don't mean we skeptics. I mean we sound science.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks the speakers. There is a box on your table. It's the first time I've seen that box. It's the word donation written on it, I think so. Yeah, and there are some envelopes. If you are not already a member of the Heartland Institute or a donor, I hope you'll take this opportunity to fill out the form, maybe put a check in there, put a few bucks in it. This event was free, but it does cost us money, so please consider doing that. The next time we meet in this room, if you come back, I believe it's going to be the Andrew Breitbart Center for Free Enterprise. A family in New York has said that they will pledge to cover the cost of dedicating this room to Andy Breitbart's memory. So that's kind of neat. Yeah. So if you have a loved one that you would like to dedicate a room at the Heartland Institute to, or a rich nephew or niece or aunt or uncle or father or mother or grandma or grandpa, let them know. There are still naming opportunities available in this building. We can cherish their memory by putting their name on a wall somewhere. Thank you very much for joining us. Feel free to stick around for a while. Good night.